Hello, my name is Hanan Schlesinger. I'm a rabbi, I'm a teacher, and I'm a peace activist. This is 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers from 1840.
So we'll begin where we always do. As an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history?
I'm feeling despondent, almost despairing. I am deeply disillusioned by what Zionism has become.
What do you mean by that?
I have lived within the Jewish story for most of my life. I've lived so deep in the Jewish story that I didn't even know I was living in the Jewish story. It was the only story I knew. I wasn't seeing it from the outside, I was seeing it from the inside. And I guess we Jews have always believed that we're special, that there are things that happen, could happen, do happen to other nations, other peoples that couldn't happen to us. And it seems to me that terrible things have happened to us. What I mean is terrible developments in the moral and spiritual fiber of us Israeli Jews as a collective and as individuals. I think that we've proven ourselves not to be any special, any different than any other.
By special,
nation.
You mean more morally or spiritually
I mean
distinct?
Morally or spiritually better, certainly not. And like many of my friends, the paradigms that we've lived our lives within have been shattered.
Which paradigms was that?
I suppose that we had a deep, deep sense, a conviction that through Zionism we are doing good for the Jewish people. We're entering a new era. We are uplifting the Jewish people, and that our uplift of the Jewish people will uplift, at least after time, the world. We'll be bringing to some type of tikkun olam, some type of reshit smichat gulatenu, some type of path towards the fulfillment of the visions of Isaiah. And that hasn't happened. And I think that Zionism has done tremendous good for the Jewish people, but I think it's also done tremendous bad for the Jewish people. I think it's done some bad things for parts of the world.
Can you be more specific when you say that it's done?
It's clear to me that I'm not being specific. I'm just,
no, that's fine. That's fine.
Just beginning to get into it.
Yeah, of course. And we have more questions to go. But I'm curious what you mean by that when you say that Zionism has done some good things for the Jewish people, for the world, and then has also done some bad things to the Jewish people and to the world.
So I don't think I said that Zionism has done good things for the world, but that was part of our hope as for the eventual fulfillment. So the good things we've done for the Jewish people, that Zionism has done for the Jewish people, to me almost don't have to be enunciated, but I understand they do have to be enunciated. We have returned the Jewish people to the stage of history. We have created an unbelievably vibrant, beautiful state with good governance. We've brought Jewish culture to a flourishing spiritually, philosophically, religiously that we couldn't have imagined 100 years ago. We've saved hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives. We've certainly saved parts of the Jewish people from some type of assimilation. We've brought a pride and a vibrancy to Judaism. All that is, of course, wonderful. That was my whole life. My whole life was Zionism, Aliyah, Jewish education, teaching Torah. But on the other side of the coin, the bad, the evil that we've done, already more than 50 years ago, Jewish thinkers, I mean the school of Rabbi David Hartman and others, were teaching and saying that the challenge of our generation, that is, that past generation, was dealing with something the Jewish people have not had for 2,000 years, which is power. And it's a truism that power corrupts. What's going to happen when the Jewish people have power, have a state, can have a military? And for me, that's no longer a question. In other words, the question was, can we use our power ethically? And the answer has been given. The answer is no. I wouldn't say it's not that we cannot, but we didn't. We didn't use our power ethically. And that's caused a moral, spiritual crisis for me.
So I want to turn to the power, so to speak, that's playing out in this war right now. What do you think has been Israel's greatest success and greatest mistake in the war against Hamas?
What has been the greatest failure, you said?
Greatest success and greatest mistake, or greatest failure?
The greatest failure has been the war itself. I already spoke publicly 4 weeks after October 7th. What I said then, I believe to this very day, which is that war, and specifically that war, this war, perhaps, under certain circumstances, can be justified, but only if there is a possibility that the war will lead to peace, that the war will lead to a political horizon that could potentially bring peace and security to the state of Israel. But since I knew, and this the government said clearly, that it doesn't have a political plan for the day after, it doesn't have a vision of how we, the state of Israel, can live in a secure peace in the Middle East. Therefore, without that, the war is fruitless and meaningless, and that it was clear to me then that thousands of people are going to die, both Israelis and Palestinians, for no benefit. And to live with that deep understanding is extremely difficult. It's my neighbors, it's my extended Jewish family who are being killed. It's human beings who I know their families on both sides of this conflict, and I don't see that it's bringing the state of Israel or the Jewish people any greater security or prosperity.
Was there any success or benefit that you saw to the war? I mean, you mentioned that, a few weeks after it first began, that you then denounced
That's a
that it
really
was going to be
hard question.
fruitful.
Let me think about that. any benefit.
And partially why I'm asking as well. I mean, we asked this question in general, but I think one of the things that are on my mind, and I think that many would feel, and I'm sure you've encountered, is that after October 7th, the question becomes, if not war, then what? Meaning, I think
Right.
people have had different conversations between the relevance or the necessity of the war at different stages, meaning October 2023, May 2024, June 2025. But in at least the beginning of October 7th, it felt that, and it seemed like Israeli society, between right, left, center, was in, for the most part, pretty strong consensus that war against Hamas was necessary, if not for peace, then at least for security and for safety and for, at that point, bringing back the Chatufim. How did you view it?
I am definitely an outlier.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of the few, certainly in the religious site in which I live, one of the few who took a position against the war. I didn't think, and I don't think, that the war is helpful in bringing back the hostages. I don't see any good that it's done for the state of Israel. I see only death and destruction and further trauma and pain and generations of potential terrorists being created. I shouldn't even say potential, I should say terrorists being created. And now you have 2 million people in Gaza who have no hope for the future, who are full of rage and anguish and pain, and in some cases probably, well, certainly, desire and dreams of revenge. That hasn't brought us anywhere. I can't see any good that has come from the war. So you asked me what would have been an alternative path. So a little bit of background, can't give a lot of background. I basically say that Hamas is two things in their own consciousness and in reality. Hamas is a violent, extremist, anti-Semitic terrorist organization based on a fundamentalist theological Islamic ideology. And in the form that it's become, probably it's impossible to negotiate with. And secondly, Hamas is an expression of Palestinian resistance against injustice and perceived injustice going back almost 100 years. So given those two aspects of Hamas, what could have been done the day after October 7th? I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question is what could have been done the day before October 7th? Because I think that Medinat Yisrael could have behaved in a different fashion such that October 7th would not have occurred. Let's be careful. Let's not say the day before October 7th, but that was a metaphor, meaning before October 7th. There were many times in which Hamas could have been negotiated with before it morphed into the Hamas of October 7th. Years before and decades before, there were many peace proposals on the table. I have an acquaintance, Gershon Baskin, who was the Israeli negotiator in the Gilad Shalit negotiations, who brought about the release of Gilad Shalit in exchange for too many Palestinian prisoners. But he has had back-channel connections with Hamas all these years. He presented certain potential plans to Netanyahu, to the government, that were rejected. There was the Saudi peace initiative. there have been many, many things happening on the ground. There was Olmert's time. Israel, I can't say for certain, of course, that there could have been successful peace negotiations, but there were openings that we decided not to take. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, I'm not saying, what I'm about to say doesn't have to be said, but perhaps there are listeners that need it to be said. I'm not saying that all the fault, God forbid, lies with the Jewish people, but some of it does. Enough of it does, and my responsibility is for the Jewish people. And when we fail ourselves, I am distraught.
How have your religious views changed since October 7th?
How have my religious views changed since October 7th? I don't think my religious views have changed since October 7th, but the aftermath of October 7th, the way that Israeli politicians have expressed themselves, especially, but not only religious politicians, and the way that some Israeli soldiers have behaved, especially religious soldiers, but not only, has reinforced for me what I have taught for decades, which is that we have certain elements within our tradition that are conducive to racism or border on racism, and that have within them the potential to cause us, we Jews who believe in them, to behave in fashions that, in my eyes, go against divine morality. And that's played out. It's played out before October 7th, but even more since October 7th. And I think that part of the efforts that we Jews have to be involved in to create a better future have to do with interpretation and reinterpretation of elements of our tradition. This is being done to a certain degree within Or Torah Stone today, the institutions founded by Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, now headed by Rabbi Kenneth Brander. Within Or Torah Stone, there's the Center, I think, for
Dialogue
Judaism, and I don't remember what it's called, Judaism and
Humanity.
Humanity, yes, thank you. Headed by my colleague and my mentor, Rav Yaakov Nagen. And they understand this deeply, and they're working in this direction. I just want to say, parenthetically, that on many matters, my criticisms of the way Jewish tradition has been interpreted go beyond what Rav Yaakov Nagen holds. I don't want anyone to think that he is as despondent or as disappointed or as radical as I am.
He was one of our early guests, actually, on the podcast.
So I think he's fantastic, even though I go further than he does in many matters.
So I want to shift a little bit away from the war specifically on October 7th and speak more broadly about your views on Israeli society and the different structures within it. What do you look for when deciding which Knesset party to vote for?
What do I look for? I look for, or let's say I would look for, a party that first and foremost espouses a stance of morality and social justice.
Have you found such a party?
There was Meimad, the party founded by my mentor and my teacher, Rav Yehuda Mital. May his memory be a blessing. And I have not found anything like it or like him since his passing.
Can you say more about how he was as your mentor?
How he was as my mentor. So the question, how I was as my mentor, Rav Amital, many people had the sense that when he was speaking to a group of 10 people or 100 people, 1,000 people, he was looking and speaking right at you. There was a sense that he understood you, that he spoke to your heart and not just to your intellect. He spoke to your humanity, to your frailties, to your hopes, to your dreams. And one of the many things he taught us is that derech eretz kadma leTorah. And to translate that already is taking a position, what it means. But for Rav Amital, it was clear that the Torah is founded upon morality. Earlier, just 5 minutes ago, I used the term divine morality. I could have said universal morality. For Rav Amital, it was the same thing. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, is fundamentally moral. And the Torah is based upon, assumes the basic human divine morality, universal morality, and then comes to build upon it. It was clear of Amital that when Abraham says to God, Shofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, the judge of all the world won't do justice. This is when Abraham is arguing with God before the destruction of the city of Sodom. It was clear to him, it was clear to all of us in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall, according to Rav Amital, that Avraham assumes that God is moral before there's anything else, and the Torah assumes that God is moral before anything else. And when the Torah is given, it is based upon the foundation of that basic menschlichkeit. And we should never, ever think that the Torah comes to abrogate or to supersede that divine human universal morality. And one of the basic and many issues with the way Judaism is being interpreted and lived and applied today in the state of Israel by people who look like me with a beard and a kippah and tzitzit, is it is being interpreted and lived and applied according to the opposite approach in Jewish philosophy, which is that there's no such thing as divine morality, human morality, universal morality. The only thing is the mitzvot. The only thing is the Torah, and anything that's not written in the simple meaning of the Torah has no validity, no force, doesn't bind us, and there's no such thing, according to this approach, as human morality. It's divine morality, universal morality. It's called, what those who disagree with me, could they say it's Christian? And if you adopt any standards that are based on universal morality or what's called natural law, you're just adopting the Goyish way. That, for me, that's one of the foundations of the moral morass that we in the state of Israel find ourselves in today.
When it comes to the state of Israel, which is more important, Judaism or democracy?
It sounds to me like it's comparing apples and oranges. Judaism is a set of values, of ultimate principles, whereas democracy is a means of government. Democracy can bring us to a political system based on Jewish values, or can bring us to tragedy, to great immorality. Now, if you ask me differently, not Judaism and democracy, but Judaism and human rights, for example, I'll give you a different answer. Do you want to ask that question?
Sure. It seems like we're already asking it.
I'm happy you asked that question. For me, human rights we'd of course have to define, there's a lot to say here, but in general, a good part of what today is called human rights falls under the rubric of natural law, of universal morality. So then if you ask me what's more important, human rights in the sense I just defined it, or Judaism, I would say that's like asking me what's more important, derech eretz or Torah. But we already said a few seconds ago that according to the Torah, derech eretz kadma Torah. And according to the Torah, universal human morality is the foundation on which Torah is constructed. By the way, this reminds me that in addition to my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Amital, whose waters I drank from, the other Rosh Yeshiva in the yeshiva I studied in, Yeshiva Taratzun, was Rav Lichtenstein. And Rav Lichtenstein wrote a very, very, very famous article on this subject exactly. Does the Torah recognize, what is it?
In ethics.
Ethics outside the framework of the Torah.
Ethics outside of halacha.
Yes, yeah. And that's exactly the subject we're talking about right now.
So, on the topic of governance and society in Israel, should Israel treat its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens the same?
That's a complicated question that has to be divided into component parts. But if I had to give a one-word answer, the answer is yes.
What makes that complicated for you?
We have here in the state of Israel two values or needs that are in tension. One is the principle of Tzelem Elokim, of the fundamental divinity of every human being, which implies the fundamental equality of every human being, the need to grant dignity and respect and freedom of choice to all people living within the borders of the state. Notice I didn't say citizens, I said all people living within the borders of the state. And on the other hand, we have a need for a Jewish state. Almost by definition, a Jewish state is going to favor those who are part of the Jewish people.
Are you saying that as how it should be, or that's just how it is?
That's the way it should be.
Uh-huh.
That's the way it should be. And how you work out that tension is difficult, complicated. It seems to me that there are better ways to work it out than the way the state of Israel has worked out until now. The vast majority of Israeli Jews don't know, and the vast majority of Jews around the world don't know the discrimination that Palestinian Israelis experience legally, de jure and de facto.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah. One of the major things that Jews in Israel and outside of Israel don't know about the experience of Palestinian Israelis is that everyone knows that to a very large degree, they live in their own towns and villages. Recently, we've always had a few mixed cities. Today we have a few more. And in those Palestinian Israeli municipalities, allocation of land since 1948 has been extremely, extremely, extremely limited. Actually, if I use the phrase allocation, then there's been no allocations. There's rather been the cutting off of chunks of land that had been part of the general borders of many, many Palestinian municipalities. So there's no room to build. And that means that families can't stay together. That means overcrowding of those who do want to stay together. And then when Palestinian Israelis are forced to move to quote unquote Jewish cities, take for example Carmiel or take for example Afula, then they suffer discrimination. One of the many expressions of discrimination is that although according to the law there are state schools Jewish and state school Arab and the state school Jewish religious, but the municipalities have by and large prevented the Palestinians from creating state Arab schools in those municipalities. I think Afula and Carmiel are two examples, but I'm not up to date exactly on the details. And then there's just the general discrimination of against Arabs because, number one, because they're not Jews, and number two, because they're Arabs. I know many, many, many Palestinian Israelis who were afraid to speak Arabic on the streets, especially since October 7th, lest they will be suspected of being terrorists. There are many cases in which Palestinian Israelis are denied the opportunity to rent an apartment in Tel Aviv because it turns out that the owners don't want to rent to Palestinians. Those are some examples.
Earlier on in the interview, you were speaking about how you've become rather afraid and pessimistic about what Zionism has become. Do you consider yourself a Zionist?
I certainly consider myself a Zionist, but I consider myself a conflicted Zionist. How do you say, an anguished Zionist? But I'm not that much concerned with labels. I'm concerned with the facts on the ground.
So now that Israel already exists, what's the purpose of Zionism?
That's, of course, a very, very good question. What's the purpose of Zionism? Well, when I think of Zionism, I think of religious Zionism. That's the world in which I live. That's my constituency. And when I say, of course, religious Zionism, I don't mean the political party. I mean the people in the movement. And we need to be involved in nurturing a Judaism that is comfortable in its land, that's creating an indigenous Jewish religious culture, that, going back to what I said earlier about dealing with power, that one of the major issues here in Zionist thought is how do we deal with Jewish power, which in this case means, at this stage in Jewish history, how do we deal with the abuse of Jewish power? How do we fix that? How do we go back to a Judaism rooted in the sources and rooted in the land that doesn't skip over 2,000 years of Jewish intellectual history? And what I'm saying is that a indigenous Jewish culture rooted in Jewish sources that doesn't behave, it doesn't think and doesn't behave as if we are the Israelites entering the land under Joshua, and doesn't behave as if the Palestinians are the 7 Canaanite nations that have to be exterminated. And that means we have to take into account the Talmudic and the halachic discourse that has interpreted Torah since then. And of course, every religious Jew knows that according to rabbinic thought, the Torah, meaning the scripture, must and always be interpreted through Jewish tradition and not directly.
One of the things that I think people find difficult with that is that you do have many, like a plethora of Israeli and Jewish thinkers who do in fact interpret tradition, do in fact interpret Jewish history and Jewish tradition and the sources and so on, and come to very different conclusions.
Absolutely.
Whether that's Rav Shal Yisraeli or whether that is different people in the Knesset or other thinkers in mainstream Zionist or, Chardal thought.
Yes.
How do you understand that?
Okay, so here's something really important. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say this. Many of my Palestinian Muslim colleagues who are fighting for peace and reconciliation and are fighting for their interpretation of Islam, which is accepting of the Jewish people and Jewish people's connection to the land, and who see reconciliation with the Jewish people and living together with the Jewish people in this land between the river and the sea as fundamental to Islam, I would say almost all of them take the position that their moral and reconciliatory interpretation of Islam is the true Islam, the only Islam. And all the other Muslim thinkers are wrong. ISIS is wrong, and Daesh is wrong, and this Islamic Brotherhood is wrong, and Hamas is wrong, and the only true Islam is the Islam that my friends espouse. And I say to them, how can you make that claim? That your Islam is the only true Islam? 90% of Islamic thinkers in the Middle East, I don't know if it's 90%, 80%, I don't know, 70%, even if it's 50%, disagree with you. How can you be certain that your Islam is the only true Islam? And the same claim I make against them, I make towards myself. In other words, I cannot claim, and I do not claim.
And so how do you respond to that claim?
I do not make the claim that my Judaism is the only true Judaism, that my interpretation, or that of thinkers that I follow in the footsteps, whether it's Rav Amital, Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Yaakov Nagen, Rav Ben Hillel, and others, Rav David Rosen, I cannot claim that our Judaism is the only true Judaism. I cannot. I have to admit that we're in the minority. But more than that, I have to admit that other thinkers have just as much of a leg to stand on within traditional Jewish sources as I do. And furthermore, I even have to admit that Judaism is as Judaism does. I take that from my mentor and friend, Rav Brad Hirschfeld, the executive vice president of Klal in New York. You can't claim that a religion is other than the way it plays itself out in history. In every generation, it is what it is. And therefore, Judaism is as Judaism does. And in this generation, Judaism is things that I call immoral. It is. I have to admit that. So now what was the question?
So I guess how do you respond to that claim? Meaning then, from what you were saying before, I understood.
Okay. So my response is that the Judaism of Bezalel Smotrich, or of Itamar Ben Gvir, or of Rav Dov Lior, or hundreds and thousands of other important, knowledgeable, well-founded Jewish thinkers, their interpretation is as much founded in the sources as mine is. Mm-hmm. It is. I have to admit that. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry about that. I'm even ashamed of it, but I have to admit it. Mm-hmm. And I can only claim not that my interpretation or the interpretation of the thinkers I mentioned that I follow in their footsteps, I can't claim that our Judaism is truer, more authentic, but I can claim that our Judaism is also true and also authentic. Elu velu divrei Elokim chayim, these and those are the words of the living God. There are many interpretations of Judaism, and I want my Judaism to win. In the competition, in the arena of Jewish ideas, I want it to win. And I think that would be better for the world and better for the Jewish people. But I have to admit that presently my interpretation is losing.
Is opposing Zionism inherently anti-Semitic?
Of course not.
What makes you say of course not?
I understand that's a question's on the table today, but to me it's almost an incomprehensible question.
I'm curious, did you always think that? And can you elaborate why?
I probably didn't always think that because I, early in my life, had narrow horizons and I didn't see the larger picture. Okay, so let's try and answer the question. And this, of course, is complicated. We have to go back. I'm not going to define anti-Semitism. I'm going to assume it's like pornography, that we know it when we see it. Although, in the end of my words, I'll add there that sometimes people see it and I don't think it's there. Zionism, for me, is and was the national liberation movement of the Jewish people that has had as one of its goals to bring the Jews out of exile and bring us back home to a independent Jewish state in which we can control our own destiny. And to a large degree, Zionism has succeeded in doing that. It's an ongoing process, but we've succeeded. I would say gloriously so. On the other hand, at the same time that Zionism was and is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, it also expressed itself in the mode of doing things of the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, up until the middle of the 20th century, which was colonialism. That was the only way that the world knew of I want to be more careful. It was one of the major modes in which masses of people were moved to a different part of the world and established their self-rule and self-government. So Zionism expressed itself to a certain degree through the modes of colonialism, sometimes by intention, but usually not so. And like most, or perhaps all colonial movements, Zionism had certain negative consequences for the local inhabitants who were there before the Jewish people came back to our land. So Palestinians have suffered greatly. By the way, part of the suffering is not only a result of the way Zionism expressed itself through those colonial means, but also as a result of certain attitudes and behaviors of the local Palestinians. Could we Jews have done it differently? I don't know. Could the Palestinians have done it differently? I don't know. But when I say I don't know, I mean that really. In other words, it could have been that we could have done it differently. Could have been that they have done it differently. I'm not sure. I just don't know. But in any case.
So meaning opposing that is not, you don't view that as anti-Semitic because there were negative consequences for others.
So for Palestinians today, what they know about Zionism is not what's written in our books, and not what's in my mind or your mind, anyone's mind. They know that in point of fact, on the ground, tachlis, it has destroyed their culture and their livelihoods and their land. Again, partly because of their own ways of reacting. So to oppose that is not anti-Semitic at all. I oppose those expressions and results of Zionism, and just about all Palestinians oppose the fact that their grandmother was killed or that their grandfather lost his land. They opposed Zionism as they see it, and some, I don't know if it's many, but some Palestinians are very anti-Zionist and have a deep, deep appreciation for the Jewish people and for the Torah.
Should Israel be a religious state?
We'd have to define that before we answer it. I would hope that Israel would be a state that is a state that provides a platform for the fullest expression of Jewish values. Let me say paradoxically that the best Jewish religious state will not be a Jewish religious state, because when you give, to use the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, when you give Judaism power, you take away influence. And I would like Judaism, I'm paraphrasing Rabbi Sachs, to have maximum influence, which means minimum power. When we say power, we mean hard power, we mean political power, we mean coercive power. When we say influence, we mean soft power. We mean the ability to persuade and to encourage Jews to express the fullness of Jewish value and practice in their daily lives. That's not accomplished by coercive religious legislation.
I know that through much of your piecework and through many of your teachers, religion you view as not just, I think this may be a paraphrase or a quote of Froman, that if religion is part of the problem, then religion must be part of the solution.
Thanks for saying that.
Do you believe that to be so? And if that's the case, what does that look like in a practical way?
Yeah, we've actually been talking around that subject for quite a bit during this podcast. So Rav Fruman did say that if religion is part of the problem, then religion must be part of the solution. And when he said if, he meant that it is part of the problem. And when he said religion, he meant Judaism. Although not only Judaism, Islam is also a big part of the problem. So this goes back to things we said earlier. Certainly, I believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh, as I believe in Jewish interpretation, right? We live Rabbinic Judaism, which is based on interpretation of 2,000 years of reading and rereading and reading and the reading of generations of interpretation. That's Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the rabbis already told us that there is no Judaism without Torah Sheba'al Peh, that Judaism is not about doing just what the Tanakh says, what the Bible says. It's about doing what the Bible says on the basis of generations upon generations of a Jewish interpretation. And now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, I'm going to say something a little bit complicated. One of the results of the return to the land, the return to the realism of Eretz Yisrael, of land of Israel, of living on the land that our forefathers walked upon, drinking from the waters that come out of, that spring from the land of Israel, living in this holy land has returned us to looking at the Bible and reconnecting to the Bible on a level of realism, and this return to the verses of the Bible is very, very invigorating and empowering and beautiful and terribly dangerous and tragic at the same time. Because what's happened is, to a certain degree, that we are unconsciously and consciously forgetting or putting aside the 2,000 years of tradition and going back to the simple meaning of the verses. That's what I had said earlier, that for some of the Jews today that I disagree with, they're living as if we today are the Israelites conquering the land under Joshua, and the Palestinians are the Canaanites. Now, according to Jewish law, through 2,000 years of interpretation, that's wrong, that's forbidden, that's not true. But we are leapfrogging over those efforts of our rabbis to, how do you say, la'aden, to make more...
to like soften or...
To soften, to make more moral some of the simple meaning of the biblical scripture, and that is tragic. So the question was, if religion is part of the problem, religion must be part of the solution. Yes, religion is part of the problem to a large degree because of the leapfrogging over Jewish tradition and going back to the simple meaning of scripture. And what we have to do today is, number one, go back to interpreting Judaism through the lens of tradition, of the oral law of the rabbis, and not just the scripture itself. And we have to continue the process that our rabbis began of continually trying to soften is not the right word, don't have a good word for la'aden. I would say to bring the way we interpret Judaism more in line with the fundamental values of Judaism.
So on that note, do you think that the state of Israel is part of the final redemption?
You gave me an out when you said part. Of course it's part. The question is what part? Is it...
Yeah, you tell me.
I believe that the state of Israel could be potentially part, not all, part of the redemption. It could be, but it might not be. Part of, but not all of. A stage. The Jewish people, today, 49% of the Jewish people is back in the land of Israel. That's one element, one of many, many elements of redemption. Depending on how we behave, morally and in realpolitik, the state of Israel could be part of the beginning stages of a continuum that brings full redemption to the Jewish people and to the world, or it could be destroyed from outside or from within. For me, there's absolutely no guarantees. And I also believe that the belief that there are guarantees is part of the guarantee that it won't be. In other words, a sense that this is guaranteed part of the redemption leads to the misuse of power, leads to cockiness, leads to haughtiness, and that leads to a corrupting of our basic values and may lead to redemption, to our destruction.
One of the things that I'm struggling with, and I assume you probably encounter this when you're speaking to other people as well, is that, throughout this interview or this conversation, we're speaking a lot about different ideas and theories of the conflict of Israelis, of Palestinians, of Zionism, and so on. And it almost feels as if it's a little bit divorced from the reality that we're facing now, meaning post-October 7th, where I think for many, especially many on the left, they felt a very strong disillusionment with the prospect of peace and of any actual resolution. And for many on the right, it was the worst confirmation of many of their fears. And where we find ourselves today in June 2025, as the war continues on, is, vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza were, in polls say that they supported October 7th. And I believe in a Pan State poll that came out recently, 82% of Israelis said that they support expulsion of Palestinians in Gaza. With all of this reality in front of us, how do you think and deal with that? Do you think that peace between Israelis and Palestinians will happen within your lifetime?
I think that peace between Israelis and Palestinians most probably will not happen in my lifetime, but I also think that it is possible within my lifetime. It's not probable, but it's possible.
Has this reality changed in any way how you view the situation?
I have met many people on the right and on the left who say that if October 7th and its aftermath has not fundamentally changed how you view reality, then you don't know where you're living. And I hold exactly the opposite. I hold that there was nothing in October 7th or the aftermath that didn't sprout organically from the reality from beforehand. I'm not saying I'm a prophet that I could have...
you could have foreseen it, but in hindsight, the seeds were there.
Not improbable. What's changed since October 7th is simply the understanding of how far away we are from peace and reconciliation, how difficult it will be to get there. And I'm talking about the social psychological difficulty, that there is so much trauma on both sides and so much need for revenge and so much blindness to the humanity and the identity of the other side that it seems close to, but not impossible. But we know other conflicts around the world that have been solved We know that there are extreme changes overnight in politics sometimes. So there's a possibility. And my responsibility is to work towards that possibility, even though it's improbable. And also, as we all know, when there is no hope for things to get better, then things cannot get better for social psychological reasons. And therefore, the propagation of hope is actually a very, very, very practical and realistic need. And part of my job is to propagate hope within me so that I can propagate hope among others.
And I assume you're referring to your work at Roots, the
referring to my
Dialogue
work at
Center,
Roots.
and other piecework. Can you talk more about that briefly?
Yeah, briefly, Roots is the Israeli-Palestinian grassroots initiative for understanding nonviolence and transformation. We were created 11 years ago as one of the co-founders in order to bring together local Israelis and local Palestinians in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, specifically in the Gush Etzion area, which is south of Jerusalem, between Bethlehem and Hebron. And there, we created the only joint Israeli-Palestinian community center. It's called the Dignity Center, the only place in the whole of Judea and Samaria where Israelis and Palestinians, local people, can and do meet each other before the war almost every day. So we had their photography workshops, we had their music therapy, we had their trauma therapy, we had their playback storytelling, we had summer camp, day camp, we had the programs for little kids, singing and arts and crafts. We had for high school kids, our youth movement. We had interfaith dialogue. We had monthly lectures on the other side's culture and religion. And we did do a lot of humanizing of the other side in both directions, but we always emphasized that humanizing the other is not enough. It's not enough for Israelis to see Palestinians as human beings, and it's not enough for Palestinians to see Israelis as human beings. You have to go further. And the second level is called identity reconciliation, that Palestinians have to come face to face with, have to come to terms with, have to recognize and respect for Jewish identity, which means that the Jewish people are a people, not a religion, not only a religion. We are a people. And we have a connection to this land. We have a deep, deep historical connection to this land. It's the land of Israel from the river to the sea. Palestinians have to recognize that. And Israelis have to recognize Palestinian identity, which is that the Palestinians are a people and they have a deep, deep historical connection to this land between the river and the sea, which means, and this is very hard for many Israelis and many Jews, many Palestinians to hear, that the land between the river and the sea, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, has two identities. It's all Israel and it's all Palestine. That's historically, that's not politics, that's history, that's identity. That Mother Earth, the Holy Land between the river and the sea, gave birth to two children. In Jewish tradition, right, we talk about Yitzhak, say in English, Isaac in English, and Yishmael. English, I don't know how you say it. Ismael, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess so.
And these two children who represent figuratively, typologically, the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, they're brothers, they're siblings, they're born to the same mother. And presently, we've been fighting over who's legitimate child of that mother. And I come and claim, and Roots comes and claims, that both children are real, legitimate, beloved children of that mother. And we have to share her.
How does your work fit into the reality that we're in right now? Meaning, where I would understand where for both Israelis and for Palestinians, there actually is no interest in dialogue, not from necessarily an ideological opposition, but from a reality position, where for Israelis who are going out to war, who are losing soldiers, who are still, suffering on a national level, they're not interested in now trying to speak to individuals that's not going to have practical change. And then for Palestinians, specifically those in Gaza or in the West Bank, who are struggling with whether it's, the ongoing war and how it affects them on a day-to-day basis, or military options in the West Bank, where dialogue may, and I've seen online from both sides, right and left, Palestinians and Israelis, critiquing this type of work right now. that it's not really doing anything for their lived reality in this moment. Has that been something that you've encountered?
Yes, indeed, the work of Roots, I mean the people-to-people work, which before October 7th was the major part of the work, is not doing anything for the immediate lived needs of the people on the ground. The people-to-people work meets, from my perspective, the psychological, moral needs of the people on the ground in the present and the future needs. What I mean is that I've heard hundreds of Palestinian parents and Israeli parents tell me that they don't want their children growing up to hate the other side. In our summer camp or in the little kids' activities, kids come home without that hate that's in the atmosphere of the cultures of both sides. That's the meeting of a real, immediate, not physical need, but a moral, spiritual need. And then, of course, people-to-people work meets the future needs with we create the reconciliation, which is a necessary, crucial and necessary component of a future peace settlement. There won't be a political peace settlement in this land, a political settlement, without a large degree of the people on both sides being willing and interested in that peace settlement, which means there must be reconciliation of identities, what I called earlier identity reconciliation. But you are right that most people on both sides are not thinking about those things right now. They're just thinking about the present, about survival. And therefore, there is, for that reason and for other reasons, there's been a serious drop-off in the number of Israelis and Palestinians interested in our people-to-people work since October 7th. The hearts have been closed on both sides, and the Palestinians are still under, to a large degree, military closure. They cannot come to joint activities. They can't leave their towns and villages in many, many cases. So Roots is continuing, but to a smaller degree, the people-to-people work. We're doing curated listening circles at present. And we've moved some of the work to other arenas. We're doing humanitarian work, which is 90% supporting Palestinians who've lost their livelihoods. Where a lot of energy is going there. We are also doing a lot of intra-communal work, not bring the two sides together, but simply Israelis separately and Palestinians separately, trying to develop and to nurture the moral consciousness of the humanity of the side, and how we can understand our identities as not being in opposition to the humanity and the identity of the other side. And after the humanitarian work and the intra-communal work, there is the anti-violence work. We work in Palestinian schools to help discourage violence and to head off violence. And even more than work in Palestinian schools, we're working among Israeli young people, the hilltop youth, and in the outposts and in settlements, working with parents, with rabbis, with teachers, with community leaders, and sometimes with the young people themselves, in order to discourage violence and to try to head it off when we see it brewing.
What do you think should happen with Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after the war?
Good question. I really don't know, because, for many causes, one of them is that Gaza is unlivable now. Right? In broad terms, there has to be, I think, a international coalition that the Arab countries have a large say in and part of. That's about an Arab-Palestinian regime in Gaza. That's about international rebuilding. That's about diplomatic relationships with Israel and Saudi Arabia, continuation of the Abraham Accords. Of course, part of that is Hamas cannot continue to be the ruling party in Gaza. And all this seems unlikely today. All this seems unlikely. Certainly, let's put something on the table, right? At least 50% of Palestinians in Gaza, according to polls, are willing to leave. Had there been a country willing to take them, I, from a moral perspective, cannot say that I'm against them leaving. But on the other hand, at the same time, in no sense am I in favor of any steps on the part of the state of Israel to make them leave or encourage them to leave. That's their homeland.
Where do you identify on Israel's political and religious spectrum? And do you have any friends on the quote unquote other side?
Yeah. So by others, I'm identified as being part of the extreme left and extreme right at the same time. Extreme left because I'm in favor, because on a level of sociology, I say that from the river to the sea is all Palestine. Of course, I also say from the river to the sea is all Israel. So those two statements, from the river to the sea is all Palestine, all Israel, that makes me part of the extreme left and the extreme right.
And where do you identify religiously?
So, but wait, that's how others identify me.
I see.
Where do I identify myself? I feel much more affinity with the left than the right, except for the fact that the left doesn't usually accept the deep Jewish connection to the whole land from the river to the sea, right? Including Beit Hillel, including Shiloh, right? Including Yerushalayim and Efrat, and including Hebron. So then you asked, how do I identify religiously? I identify religiously as part of the progressive orthodoxy.
And if you're not comfortable talking about
But
this,
let me say that I do not limit myself to discourse with Orthodox Jews or progressive Orthodox Jews. I have many friends and colleagues who are Reform Jews and unaffiliated Jews, and who are Christians and who are Muslims, even deeply believing Christians and deeply believing Muslims. You asked if I have connections to people who are not part of my
friends
camp.
on the other side.
Most of my colleagues in Shorashim and Roots are settlers, right, who look like settlers. And I have deep connections to them. We work together all the time. And partially we share ideology and partially we don't. In my family, there's all types. There are those who followed me. There are those who have not followed me. I don't have any Haredi friends, although I'm having a meeting with a potential one tomorrow.
Oh, hope it goes well. And if this is too personal, we're welcome to skip it. But I know that before our interview began, you mentioned that you were living in Alon Shvut and you moved to Yerushalayim, which from our conversation I gleaned is likely because of political reasons related to everything now. How did you come to that decision, and has that affected your relationships with others?
As it affected my relationship, okay, we'll go back to that. We'll start with I don't call my move political. I call it ethical political, because it's not that I left Alon Shvut because I thought that area should be or will be eventually part of a Palestinian state. I'm not saying that I agree or disagree, but that's not the reason. The reason was ethical political, because I began to understand, even more so since the war, that although the settlement movement is based upon the real, legitimate, true Jewish connection to the whole land of Israel from the river to the sea, including Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and therefore Jews have a deep connection to that land and have a, in principle, right to live in that land. Although that's all true, at the same time, the fashion in which that connection to the land, Judea and Samaria, is being expressed through the settlement movement, incorporates many elements that come at the expense of the Palestinian people, the deep expense. Land is being taken, rights are being restricted, livelihoods are being suppressed. And I saw how, by living in Alon Shvut, I am part of systematic oppression. And I could no longer stomach that.
So for our last question.
Oh, but then you asked
Yeah.
me, how do my colleagues relate to
Oh
it?
yeah, has that affected any of your relationships?
No, I will say truthfully, but tongue in cheek, that one and perhaps more of my Palestinian colleagues are disappointed that I'm leaving. Because although they agree with everything it just said, they said, but Hanan, by living there, you're able to influence your neighbors to make the reality better. By living there, you're just 5 minutes away from me, or I'm on the road and I make a phone call, come and help me, and now you're gone. So there's some truth in that, but I counter and I say that I basically lost most of my influence among the settler population because my moral vision has expanded to a point in which we see different realities. So I don't think I'm doing any disservice to the Palestinians by moving, and I'm making a statement that's important for me, and I hope may be important for others.
Our final question. Do you have more hope or fear for Israel and the Jewish people?
Fear. I have, and I always will have hope, and I will live my life on the basis of that hope. And I will, and I think I succeed in not letting the fear dictate my actions. But yes, I have deep trepidation for the future of the Jewish people in the land of Israel.
Okay. Well, Hanan, thank you so much for answering our 18 questions. How was this for you?
Thank you for helping me to think.